Hi class, this is going to be the first video on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Um, First of all, we are going to look pretty closely at one of the passages in the textbook, so I would encourage you before going too far on this video to go get it so you can kind of read side by side with me. So before that though, it's important that we make a transition. So we're finished with the Kant and we're moving on to Aristotle, fine, but what you have to realize is that Aristotle's virtue ethics is going to be unlike any other ethics we've looked at this semester in one very important sense. And that is because we are now making the transition to virtue ethics. And it's kind of a different question because everything we've looked at in the semester up to this point have put actions as primary. That is, how ought I act is the central, most important question. When we shift to virtue ethics, however, the question is about what kind of person I ought to be. And that's a different question. Of course, the two are related, as we're going to talk about later in the semester. But it is fundamentally a different question. So we're going to say a few words about virtue ethics in general. First of all, you might see virtue ethics as trait ethics or character ethics or Aritaic ethics. If that's confusing, it's actually because of the history of philosophy. As we will see, the word that gets translated to virtue in Aristotle, arete, just means something like personal excellence. And so the word virtue, however, tends to have a lot more baggage than that, and it's because St. Thomas Aquinas basically tried to Christianize Aristotle in the 13th century, and so that has caused a little bit of skewing of how we read Aristotle sometimes. So there's that. Second of all, though, how do we evaluate in terms of actions? We still can. And so even though virtues or character traits are primary, we can use those in order to evaluate actions. So we can still evaluate actions, of course. So if I say, I see a kid drowning in the pond, and I try to save them because I'm expecting a reward, well, what does that say about my character? Then I'm greedy. And so that kind of action, Aristotle would agree with Kant on that, well, but it's not the intent, it's because of what it says about your character. Greed is a vice, therefore an action that is a manifestation or indicative of vice is impermissible, whereas actions that are indicative of virtue or manifestations or cultivations of virtue are good. So, of course, we can still evaluate actions, but we evaluate them based on what it says about your character. So, that's the general idea. Now, in terms of Aristotle's descriptors, he is certainly an objectivist. He's certainly a virtue ethicist. There's a little bit of scholarly argument about whether he's an absolutist about virtues or not. This is an intro course. We're getting cookie cutters, so we're just going to go ahead and say, yes, he's an absolutist about virtues. So what matters to ethics for Aristotle is what an action says about your virtues, about your character traits. So that's something to bear in mind. The next thing, like we did in utilitarianism, like we did in looking at Kantian ethics, we're going to divide into two parts about why we should be virtue ethicists and then about how to be virtue ethicists. And so that's, of course, going to be how the distinction in the videos runs as well. And so today's video, we are going to be talking about primarily how to be, why we should be virtue ethicists. So, a little bit of background. You've probably heard of Aristotle. He was Plato's most famous student, but he's also credited with the father of a lot of stuff. So if someone asks you what's the father of blank, you should probably just guess Aristotle. So he's considered the father of logic, father of biology, father of astronomy, etc., etc., etc. It might be an overstatement to say he invented science, but it's not much of one. And so the reason I'm telling you about this isn't just to get you excited about Aristotle, but to emphasize how he's going to approach things. Aristotle was first and foremost a scientist in some senses. He says knowledge starts with what's in front of us. If you ever seen, you know what, I'm just going to show you. Let's break it up a little. So if you've ever seen Raphael's famous painting, The School at Athens, is really indicative of how Aristotle approaches things. So there's Raphael's School of Athens. And notice there's two prominent figures in the middle there. The older one, Plato, is pointing to the heavens. And Aristotle's saying, no, and pointing at the ground. And that's really indicative of how we learn and where we come to get our knowledge. Aristotle was very hands-on. As far as we know, he is the first person to ever do dissections. And knowledge, even knowledge of ethics, is going to start with what's in front of us. But the second reason this is relevant, though, one of the other reasons that Aristotle gets credited with father of blah, is because he invented this really cool thing called research. Before he wrote a book on physics, he would read other books in physics and see what they got right and wrong, etc., and then give his take on things. And so we're going to see that in part one. Part one in terms of the lecture, not part one of the reading. Is he's going to look at other theories of ethics, specifically other approaches to the good life. And he's going to do two things. He's going to reject them, that is, he's going to tell you what the problem is. But in so doing and in so rejecting, he is going to, basically, that's going to help us figure out what a theory of ethics needs to look like. And so that's really what we should be doing. So this is the point at which you should take your book out and start looking at where it says section 5. Sorry, my book is still on campus. I believe, if memory serves me, it's on page 405. But if not, just find the section 5. It starts with let us resume. I'll give you a second to get your book. Feel free to pause. All right. Also, this might not be the exact same translation because, again, I don't have my textbook. Sorry, it's locked in the lockdown campus. So, he's going to give 3 approaches to the good life and tell us why they're flawed. And it's important. So, let us resume our discussion from the point at which we have digressed. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem, not without reason, to identify the good or happiness with pleasure, which is the reason why they love the life of enjoyment. For there are, we may say, 3 prominent types of life. That just mentioned, the political, and the contemplative. So, Aristotle's going to tell us 3 alternate approaches to the good life, what you want to pay attention and might want to write down. What do they say is the good life? Why is that why is that mistaken? And the third thing then, what does that teach us? So we're just going to go through these. Now, he doesn't give a snappy name for the first kind. He says that just mentioned. That's usually nowadays called the vulgar approach to the good life. And here's what he says about them. The mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts. That's a criticism. So, first of all, what is indicative of the vulgar life? How do we define it? Those who say that the good life is the pursuit of pleasure. Nowadays, we have a name for that. Remember, those who say that the pursuit of personal pleasure is the good, we call hedonists. And so what Aristotle calls the vulgar life, you should think of as the hedonist. Well, what's Aristotle's criticism there? The only one he gives is that it's a life suitable to beasts. And so the problem with the vulgar life, the problem with hedonism, is it's not worthy of humans. Well, what does that tell us? That a satisfactory theory of ethics must be suitable to, worthy of humans. Ethics is a human concern, and our theory of ethics needs to reflect that in a way the vulgar life does not. Now, it's interesting, he says they get something right there, and we will circle back to that in a little bit. But for now, let's move on to the political life. And from here he says, but people of superior refinement and of active disposition identify happiness with honor. For this is, roughly speaking, the end of the political life, end in the sense of goal, like we talked about in Kant. And he's going to give two criticisms of that, but I want to pause here before we talk about it, because some people get the wrong idea when he says honor. The political life is not to be equated with trying to be honorable, the Bushido code or what have you. No, even though the literal translation is honor, you want to be thinking in terms of honors plural. So it's called the political life because these are the people who think that the good life is to try to receive rewards and acclaim and accolades from the city. So think of by honors, think of things like key to the city kind of stuff. And Aristotle's going to give two criticisms of that view. So the political life is a life of pursuing political honors and recognition, but it seems too superficial for what we are looking for, since it is thought to depend on those who bestow honor rather on him that receives it. But the good we divine to be something of one's own and not easily taken. So that's criticism one. Criticism one, we nowadays have a word for too. It depends on those who bestow it. And using our fancy terminology from Unit 2, what he just told us is the problem with the political life is it is relative. It is relative to the bestower. Would anyone be the proud recipient of the Hitler Peace Prize or the Albert Fish Humanitarian Award or the Sean Hannity Award for Critical Thinking? No, those are things you would be embarrassed to receive. And it's not a good thing because of the person bestowing it. And so the first criticism of the political life is that it is relative to the bestower, which means, what does that tell us about a satisfactory theory of ethics? That must be objective. Focus. But there's a second criticism here. Further, men seem to pursue honor in order that they may be assured of their merit. And so, let me skip the rest of that for a second. The general idea is something we've come across a little bit in the Kant earlier. Well, wait a minute. What kind of honors did they get? So in ancient Greece, you know what your honor would be? It would be in the form of a laurel, so that nice little leafy thing you wore on your head. But nobody is saying the good life is collecting floral headwear. No, you don't want the laurel itself. You want what you could get with the laurel. That is the prestige, the fame, the free drinks, all of that kind of stuff. And so the problem, if we want to use Kant's terminology, is that the honor is the means. The honor is how we get what we want rather than actually what we want and what we actually put value in. Well, what is it that we actually put the value in? And this goes back to what the hedonic life got right. Well, not floral headwear, but the thing that is what Aristotle calls a self-sufficient good, something that is good in and of itself. What is that? Happiness. He talks quite a bit later about the happiness being the one and only self-sufficient good. And so let's pause there. First of all, what's the other criticism of the political life? That it aims at, to use Kant's term, a means rather than an end. And so what does that teach us about a satisfactory system of ethics? It has to be directed towards the thing that is good in itself, the self-sufficient good, which is also a basic good for Aristotle. And that one basic or self-sufficient good is happiness. Now, going back, notice he said that the life of the vulgar seem, not without some reason, to identify the good or happiness with pleasure. So there is a sense that the vulgar got something right, that they should be aiming at happiness. What did they get wrong? As we saw, it's the way they do it is suitable to beasts. And so you'll notice the vulgar actually are aiming, roughly speaking, at the right thing, but their way of trying to attain it is wrong. They're trying to get to happiness like an animal would get to happiness instead of how a human would. So that's going to weigh in when we start seeing what a satisfactory system of ethics needs to look like for Aristotle. So we have to be aimed at the right thing and approaching it in the right way. Let's talk about the third type of ethics that Aristotle talks about, the contemplative. And this is the start of section 6. And we're going to do the minimum necessary because who are the contemplative? He says the philosophers. Who he really means is Plato, his teacher, the person he spent studying under in the academy for 26 years. So bear that relationship in mind when we start reading section 6. We had perhaps better consider the universal good, that's what Plato said was the good life, and discuss thoroughly what is meant by it. Although such an inquiry is made an uphill one by the fact that the forms, capital F, same as the universal good, the form of good I should say, have been introduced by friends of our own, that is Plato. Yet, it would perhaps be thought to be better, indeed to be our duty, for the sake of maintaining the truth, even to destroy what touches us closely, especially as we are philosophers. For while both are dear, piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. What's going on there? Saying, look, Plato, I love you, but first and foremost, you taught me to be a philosopher, which means I pursue truth no matter what and no matter who it offends. And so the first paragraph in section 6 is a long apologetic way of saying, well, this is why I'm about to criticize, my master Plato's view that the good is to be equated with some universal form of good. So let me say as little as I can about the form of good. We talked a little bit about this in divine command theory and Neoplatonism. Plato was what you call a realist about universals. What does that mean? Let me give you the shortest version I can. Well, who thinks that the law of gravity is a real thing? Well, presumably all of you. If not, feel free to start levitating. Okay, the law of gravity is a real thing. Where is it? Everywhere? Nowhere? An abstract realm called Platonic heaven, perhaps? All I know for sure is that when I drop a pen, I see the law of gravity acting on that pen. And so the general idea is there are these abstract things that are still real and exist and act on the world. And if you replace law of gravity with goodness, you're in the ballpark. Goodness is a real, universal thing, form with a capital F, idea with a capital I, depending on the translation. It's a real thing that nevertheless acts on the world in a sense, just like the law of gravity acted on the pen. So that's the very general idea. I don't want to make it more complicated than I have to. If you're interested, great. Love to talk about those things. Maybe take the introduction to the ancient philosophy upper division course on main campus. So what is the criticism of that view? That's the more important thing because we're going to learn from it. The men who introduced this doctrine did not posit ideas of classes within which they recognized priority and posteriority, but things are called good both in the category of substance and in that of quality and in that of relation, in that which is per se is prior to the nature of the relative, so that there could not be a common idea set over all these goods. All right. Here's what Aristotle is saying there. Aristotle is saying, well, if Plato's system is correct, then what we can call good are things. That's what he means by substances. And he says, and Aristotle says, well, wait a minute. We want to call more stuff than that good. We want to call certain relations good. I would like to call fatherhood a good thing, but that's a relation. We would also like to equally call qualities such as justice and wisdom good. And the general criticism there is that Plato's apparatus doesn't really let us do that in the way we want to. Take Aristotle's word on that. He studied under Plato for 26 years. He's probably right about the Plato. But more important, so the contemplative life says goodness is a universal form. What's the problem with that? It only really lets us call substances good when in fact we want to call relations and qualities good as well. So what do we learn? What does a satisfactory system of ethics need to do? It needs to be able to call substances good, yes, like by substance I mean things like you and I, but also qualities and relations. And so that's what we're looking for. So put it all together. What have we learned about ethics? It needs to be something that is worthy of humans and approaches things in a way that is primary to humans. It needs to be objective in doing so, and it needs to aim at the right thing, the basic self-sufficient good happiness, and it needs to do so in a way that lets us call persons, qualities, and relations good. If Aristotle's system can succeed, it can do all of those things. And so what we're going to watch for is how Aristotle does that. He does that with a thing called the function argument. So I'm going to pause stop recording the video here because I want you to be able to look and find Aristotle's function argument. You might want to Google around with it a bit. But ultimately, this is going to be his argument that isolates what it is that actually makes something good. And in theory, if the function argument succeeds, it's going to fulfill all those criteria we just gave. So that's what we're working on. So go find the function argument, find it in the text, find it on Google, work on it, come prepared to watch the next video based on that.